Hey everybody, Thomas Joseph here, and today we are tackling meatloaf. Now, meatloaf is one of America's favorite comfort foods, but oftentimes it's either bland, dry, or crumbly, or a combination of all three. Well, today I'm gonna share with you all of the tricks and tips along the way in making meatloaf, and you will have something that you would want to put on your table any night of the week. So let's talk about the meat. That's the most important part of a meatloaf. Now, when you go to your neighborhood grocery store, this is probably what you're going to find. A finely ground meat, usually beef, but sometimes there's a blend of meats. You wanna make sure that you're using the right proportions, and proportions are a ratio of meat to fat. Now, typically sold, you have an 80% to 20% meat to fat ratio. And then there's also leaner versions that are 90 to 10%. And you wanna make sure that you avoid that kind of low range of fat to meat ratio, that 90-10, because you really need enough fat within your meatloaf to keep it nice and moist and tender. Now, another thing to think about, and if you can do this, you really should, maybe you should ask the butcher in your supermarket to grind your meat fresh for you and to grind it coarsely. Now, here in front of me, I have pork and beef that is 80-20, that same ratio that we're recommending, but it's coarsely ground, and you can see how much texture there is here in this meat, versus what you would get if you bought a prepackaged ground meat, which is nice and finely ground. Now, the reason I am encouraging you to get coarsely ground meat is because that means that it's not overworked. You're going to take this meat and you're gonna mix it up with all of the seasonings and flavorings and binding ingredients, and you're gonna work it together with your hands. So you wanna start with something that's a little bit more coarse, because in the end, you will end up with a better, more tender texture to it, something that's not too worked. Now, I'm using a blend of meats today, and I have ground chuck and I have ground pork here. Now, you could use a combination, your favorite combination. If you wanted a turkey meatloaf, you could do a dark meat ground turkey. That would be fantastic. You can even mix that in with your ground beef. Some people like to use veal. I don't typically like to do that. Today I'm using an equal ratio, so this is 1.25 pounds of each, ground pork and ground chuck. Now, chuck is a cut from the shoulder of the cow, of the beef. And it is a heavily worked muscle, and it works really well here in ground form because it has a ton of flavor, and you're breaking up the muscle fibers when you grind it so that it will have a nice tenderness to it in the end. So you wanna make sure that they're nice and cold so that the fat doesn't melt, so keep them in your refrigerator until you're ready to use them. I'm gonna start here with the binding portion of the meatloaf, something that will keep your meatloaf nice and together, but not too rock hard. I'm using white bread today, just regular store-bought, and I'm gonna start with 4 slices. So I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna break it up into my food processor here, and ultimately I'm looking for about 3 cups of fresh breadcrumbs. Now, if you can find fresh breadcrumbs at your grocery store, you could certainly use those. The one thing I would tell you to do is to steer away from store-bought, already ground dry breadcrumbs, because those are dry, they're absent of moisture, and unless you really rehydrate them very well, you're going to end up with a dry meatloaf, because all those dry breadcrumbs are going to pull all of the moisture out of the meat, out of whatever else you're adding into your meatloaf, and ultimately in the end you might end up with something that's a little bit more dry. So fresh breadcrumbs are really my preference, and I like to make them in a food processor from scratch. So break up the bread into little pieces and process this bread into fine crumbs. And you can pulse this together using your food processor. That looks good. And now I'm just going to go through and make sure that I have enough breadcrumbs here. And I need 3 cups in total, like I had said before. All right, so we have 3 cups of breadcrumbs here, and I'm gonna keep the food processor because I'm going to now pulse together a little bit of onion and garlic, and these are going to add great moisture and flavor to the meatloaf. And before I do that, I'm gonna take a 1/2 cup of whole milk, and I'm going to saturate my breadcrumbs here with this whole milk. Now, some recipes call for water, which is fine. You could certainly use water, but I think milk adds a bit of a richness to your meatloaf, so that's typically what I use. So just stir this together, let the crumbs kind of soften and saturate a little bit. So I'm using one small yellow onion here, just removing the peel and cutting this into, you know, decent sized pieces, because this is going right into the food processor. You don't have to finely mince it. And I'm using raw onion and garlic today. Now, if you had an aversion to kind of that punchy flavor of raw onion and garlic, you could certainly saute this mixture after you pulse it together to get rid of some of the harshness. But what I like about adding raw ingredients into the meatloaf mix is that it has a lot of really great moisture, and that moisture is going to intermingle with those breadcrumbs and the meat, and you're going to end up with something that's very tender and juicy. So pulse together these ingredients until you get a nice fine consistency. Now you might have to scrape down the side of the food processor once or twice. This is looking good. And now I'm gonna add some parsley. And I like to add herbs into my meatloaf mix because I think it adds really great color, first of all, but also a nice fresh flavor. So this is a handful of parsley that's been coarsely chopped. Now, if you wanted to use a different herb, you certainly could here. Even some woodsy herbs like thyme would be really great in your meatloaf mix. If you like chives, you could certainly add that here as well. And of course, you can customize the seasoning. Now, I'm using salt and pepper, just straightforward today. So this is 2.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. So I wouldn't change the ratio of salt here because that salt is needed to flavor all of the meat. And 3/4 teaspoon of black pepper. I'm also going to add at this stage 1 egg. So egg is also going to help bind the ingredients together, but as you can see, we're not adding too many eggs. If you add too many eggs, you're gonna end up with something that's pretty solid, and you really want something that holds together but isn't too tough. So I'm gonna add the egg right into the food processor here. And then a secret little ingredient is a bit of Dijon mustard. This adds a nice tanginess to your meatloaf mix. You could use a different type of mustard if you wanted to add like a spicy brown mustard. That would be really fantastic here as well. Now, in addition to the mustard, you could add a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, you could add a little bit of tomato paste, anything that will kind of amp up the flavor, you can add at this stage right now. So now all I'm gonna do is pulse this together just until the egg and the onion is incorporated, but I'm not gonna over process this into a fine paste. So there you go, guys. This looks fantastic. The texture is really nice. It's uniform. It's not too broken down and pasty. It has a little bit of texture, which is really great because when you slice into a meatloaf, you want to be able to see some of the bits there. But this is great, ready to go. Now, we're gonna start by mixing everything together. So what I like to do before I add the meats, I like to mix all of the ingredients together so that I'm not manipulating the meat too much. So now I'm gonna add this onion mixture right here into the bread crumb mixture. And this is actually a little trick that I learned from a really great butcher who was teaching me how to make Italian sausages. And their little trick was in combining all of those wonderful spices like fennel and chili flake and salt and pepper with a little bit of water and adding it into the ground meat. And this way, the liquid easily mixed into the meat without overworking the meat and making it tough. So if you do this, you will end up with a nice tender meatloaf. So just combine this together. And now it's time to add the meat. So again, I'm using 1¼ pounds of ground chuck here, you guys, right into the bowl. This is coarsely ground, and 1¼ pounds of ground pork. Now, ground pork is also typically the shoulder cut of the pig, and that has really great flavor. So I'm gonna start here with my rubber spatula and just try to combine this as much as possible, but then it's gonna happen, guys. You need to get your hands into this mix to mix it all together. So this is actually a trick that I learned from my father, and I'm gonna get rid of my watch too. The one thing that you want to do is keep this mixture as cold as possible because you don't want the fat in the meat to melt. You want to keep the fat in nice big pieces because again, it will help keep your meatloaf really nice and moist and tender. So chilling your hands in a little bit of ice water, it might seem like a painful thing to do, but it will really help in keeping the fat nice and cold in your meat mix. Now, I'm using my hands here to kind of turn the meat over in and on itself, evenly dispersing the breadcrumb and all of those wonderful flavorings into the meat without breaking it up into too fine of pieces. So kind of spinning the bowl, turning and folding the meat up over itself. Now this recipe here is enough to make 2 meatloafs. We're gonna freeform these meatloafs. We're not using a loaf pan, but you could certainly do that if you would like. That's kind of the classic way. I think a lot of our moms made meatloaf was in one of those glass loaf pans, but I like to freeform the loaf because it has more surface area to it and you get more of a wonderful crust. And we're gonna be using a glaze here. So this looks good. Just gonna move this out of the way here, guys. And now, you're gonna portion this meat mixture into 2, so by half, and just do it right in the bowl. You can kind of settle the meat into the base of the bowl and then use your hand to kind of cut through and just portion out half of the meat. And this is going onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. As I said before, guys, this is a free-formed meatloaf, and you want to portion the meatloaf out into a 4 by 8 inch kind of oval, about, I would say, 1.5 inches in thickness. Now, one thing that happens with freeform meatloafs is as they bake, sometimes they kind of settle down. So err on the side of creating something thicker than thin. And now we're ready to glaze this. Now I'm gonna go wash my hands really quickly, but I'm gonna come back and show you what the glaze is. So for the glaze for our meatloaf, I'm using 3 tablespoons of ketchup and a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, and I'm just gonna mix these 2 together. Now, if you were a fan of chili sauce, you could certainly use that in place of the ketchup. You'll have something that's similar, but maybe a little bit more spicy. But these 2 ingredients together really create a fantastic glaze for your meatloaf. And the reason why is because each of the components has a ton of ingredients in them individually. Ketchup is tomato and vinegar, so it has a nice bit of acidity to it. And Worcestershire sauce has so many ingredients like anchovies and spices, so it really adds a great punch and depth of flavor. So now using a bristled brush, just brush this all over your loaf. Make sure your oven is preheated to 425 degrees with the rack positioned in the middle of the oven. And this meatloaf is gonna bake for 35 to 45 minutes until an instant read thermometer, which is inserted into the center of the meatloaf, registers about 160, could even go up to 165 degrees. Now, with the remaining meat mixture that we had, you could certainly use that to make another meatloaf, or you could use it to make meatballs. This is a really versatile mixture of meats and aromatics. So this is going into the oven, again, 425 degrees in the middle of the oven. So the meatloaf has been out of the oven. It's rested for about 10 to 15 minutes. It's important, guys, whenever you're kind of baking or roasting meat, that you let them rest after cooking so that the juices have a chance to kind of redistribute throughout. And this has been resting for about 15 minutes. You can see how great it looks with that wonderful glaze that's covering a good portion of the top of the meatloaf. And I'm gonna cut a piece off here, guys. I actually really enjoy the end piece. I think it has a delicious amount of glaze. And you can see that it's cutting nicely, but it's nice and tender. It's not crumbling apart into pieces. And I'm gonna place this on my plate. And again, guys, remember all of those tricks and tips, and you will end up with a wonderful, delicious, flavorful, juicy meatloaf like this. I'm sure you're gonna love this recipe. I encourage you guys to try it and kind of tweak the flavors and make it your own. And let us know if you have any kitchen conundrums. We love to hear from you. Enjoy, guys. And as always, guys, click like and subscribe.